I'm doing this video to give you some kind of idea of what to expect in terms of performance from the new M1X processors that will be coming out, hopefully in a couple of months. I'll give you an idea of how much power they're expected to draw. You should be able to infer battery life from that. The CPU performance that they'll give us, and also graphics performance as well. And to help show you what those figures will be like, I'm going to compare it against, say, the competition, one from Intel and one from AMD. In fact, two from Intel, two different varieties that they've got. So let's start. First of all, power draw. Typical high-end CPUs available from AMD, the 5900HX, which is basically nominally a 45 watt CPU, but will draw up to 60 watts when under load. So thermal design power figures are a bit of a lie. The peak power draw for the AMD 5900X is about 60 watts. The Intel 11885G7 has a peak power draw of about 55 watts. Again, nominally a 45 watt processor, but no. Then there's the Intel 11980HK, which I think is nominally a 65 watt processor, but it does draw up to 110 watts in standard configuration. And in fact, it goes even higher in non-standard configuration. Some manufacturers of laptops can adjust their parameters, and this thing can draw like 130 watts in a laptop. That's crazy. All right, compare that with the M1, and we can see in Apple's machines, so for example, the MacBook Air, this thing draws no more than 24 watts. Like, that's the absolute peak that it'll draw. And because we know that from Anantech's information research, we know that the most power-hungry component of the M1 CPU is the actual CPU cores themselves, the Firestorm cores. And there are, in fact, twice as many Firestorm cores in the M1X as there are in the M1. We can expect to draw twice as much power, so 48 watts. So if you look at the charts, you can see that the M1X will be still significantly under the competition. Moving on, what sort of performance can you expect out of a M1X compared to the competition? Well, these are Geekbench figures from CPUs that I've mentioned. So this is the Geekbench comparison figures. So the only figure that's calculated here is the M1X figures. You can see that the M1 has a significant lead in single core performance over the competition, and that shows around the general purpose efficiency of the M1 CPU. It's a fair way ahead. The Intel 11980HK does go most of the way catching up compared to, say, its 1185G7 counterpart, and that's because it puts a lot of wattage and heat into a single core to make up some of the difference. And you can see with this CPU, it actually falls away. There's 8 cores in this CPU, but this figure is not 8 times this figure, and that's because when you start using all the cores, the power draw goes up enormously, and therefore heat goes up enormously, and to cope with that, it actually reduces the megahertz rating on the CPUs down a bit, and so therefore it's a smaller figure. So just running through the calculation, there's no reason, because it'll be running Firestorm cores, there's no reason why the M1 will be any better than the M1X will be any better than the M1. And using simple extrapolation, we can work out that approximately in the multi-CPU department, the M1X will have a score of about 12,000, beating out the competition handily. The 1185G7 only has 5,000 because it's a 4-core CPU, really. So it's really showing Intel falling away dramatically in the 4-core department. The AMD 5900HX has a very commendable score of 8,000, but once it starts getting against real competition like the M1X, you can see it's basically 2/3 of the performance. Here we are onto Cinebench. Now, Cinebench is a very specialized workload. It only uses a small portion of instructions on the CPU. So if the CPU is designed to optimize those instructions, well, it's going to do well. And from my perspective, it appears that it's very megahertz tied. So it's not utilizing the benefits of things like caching and branch prediction and pipeline depth or lack thereof that you can get in the M1. It's pure megahertz as far as I can tell, and the number of cores matters as well. So you can see in this one, all of the CPUs excepting the Intel 11980HK have basically the same score, 11,480, give or take a few. And the HK falls ahead, again, because it's putting money, or power, I should say, into megahertz, so it just throws power at the problem, gets a few more megahertz, and therefore gets a slightly better score in that department. But you can see it falls away. It's got 8 cores, but this figure is not 8 times that figure there. So it should be doing better than that. But I think that even with the sheer massive power budget available to that CPU, it's just not doing as well. Commendably, the AMD 5900HX has got a massive score, nearly 1300. It's also an 8-core CPU, but you can see AMD have got some megahertz on their side and a lot of cores, and they're utilizing it well. Impressive result. But the M1X, the predicted score for that, 15,000, should trounce the competition nicely. So you can expect a lot out of this CPU. Moving on into GPU results. Now I've used Geekbench Metal here for the real scores and the estimates for the M1 and M1X. And for comparison, that you can't actually run the Metal benchmark on Intel or AMD's GPUs, but I've included estimates here based on the relative performance of these GPUs to other GPUs that we do know the performance of, just so you've got a rough idea of how they sit now compared to the competition. So here's for reference, here's some GPUs that are well known, and so you should be able to establish a baseline of performance compared to what we're getting out of the M1 and M1X. So the 5700 gives you 72,000. The 6900 XT is giving you about 140,000. The M1 gets you 20,000, which is a respectable level of performance. And then because the M1X has the 16-core version, will have twice as many cores. You roughly expect doubling of performance. And the M1X 32-core will double again. Now, it's important to note that not every GPU performance problem is solved by simply throwing more cores at the problem. So, for example, AMD had a problem with a Vega architecture where, yes, you could throw more cores at it, but you got a point of diminishing returns where it was getting bottlenecked at a different point other than the processing capability by the number of cores. And so you could have 40 cores, pretend, and it would give you a certain level of performance. And if you had 80 cores, well, you weren't getting double performance. In fact, you probably weren't even getting 50% more performance because of that bottleneck. There's no reason to think that Apple have hit that problem, but I guess we'll find out when the real thing gets released. Now, to compare the existing CPUs, you can see the performance of the M1 is actually pretty good. It's definitely better than Intel's onboard variant. The 1185G has pretty much woeful performance, about half the performance of the M1. But to AMD's credit, they're doing a great job. And in fact, most of the stats in this video show you that the AMD CPUs are generally solid offerings, and they're actually better than the M1, or have more performance available than the M1 if that's what you're interested in. And it won't be until the M1X comes out that it'll get shaded. All right, so the estimate for AMD's 5900HX, I came up with 34,000 metal score. So you can, even the small version of the M1X will basically beat it, and the 32-core version will more than double its performance. All right, well, hopefully that gave you an indication of what level of performance to expect out of the M1X. If you've got anything to comment, or if you think I'm wrong for some reason, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll definitely be interested in hearing your feedback and have a discussion about that. All right, thanks. Bye.